Welcome to this webinar, and thank you for joining this webinar today on how you cannot teach an old dog new tricks. And the idea, the plan for today is for myself. I'm responsible for product management at Watchful Software. My name is Rui Vizcaya, and Eric Anselman, which is the research director at 451 Research, to talk to you a little bit about the fallacy of the secure perimeter approach. We have a few people, attendees, still joining the webinar. We have several people enrolled to the webinar, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a house rules in terms of how this webinar will take place and give you a little bit of introductions in the meantime. So let's hope that a couple more people can join in the interim. But as I've said, the motto for this presentation, for this webinar, is how you cannot teach an old dog new tricks, and which is the same as saying that the secure perimeter approach is a fallacy in our days. The agenda, we will follow this agenda. The idea is to give you the introductions, who we are and why we're talking about this. Then Eric will give you some insights on effective data protection requires, on how effective data protection requires change based on some figures and numbers that Eric will explain. I will also then give you some insight on how to tackle the compromised security perimeter via a different approach, which is to say the data-centric information approach. We will also be able to provide a live demo of a solution called RightsWatch that is really a way for you to implement data-centric security. And at the end, we will have Q&A session, and you're more than welcome to ask any questions. If you can use the chat button, the chat option on GoToWebinar. We have Patricia also on the line that will help us out in handling all those questions at the end, at the Q&A session. So please do ask those questions. We will make sure that we will be able to address those at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, and let me introduce you Eric. Eric is a chief analyst at 451 Research. Eric has a lot of experience in the realm of information security, networks, virtualization. So Eric has agreed to talk to us today a little bit about why there's a change that needs to be made on this, on how to address information protection and control. I'll let then Eric explain via a few slides that he has prepared for us what change it is and how that change can be made possible. Myself, I serve as Director of Product Management for Watchful Software, and I'm also responsible for the company's go-to-market strategy and product direction. Some house rules, I mean, just to get us started on how this is going to work. I mean, you're centrally muted, so there's no need for you to mute and unmute yourself. The idea is for us all to be able to listen to what Eric and myself will be saying, and then at the end, as I've said, I mean, by all means, do ask all the questions. We will make sure that we'll have time to answer to those. We are predicting that this webinar will last for 40 to 45 minutes so that it doesn't extend that much beyond that time. Patricia will be the timekeeper in that sense, and she will make sure that we end up at the end of 40 to 45 minutes. But the webinar, and for those that unfortunately may have to leave in the interim or something like that, the webinar, or those that were not able to join us today, the webinar will be recorded, or is being recorded, and it will be made available on watchfulsoftware.com website, and you all will receive an email with a link where you can have access not only for the recording of the webinar in itself, but also the slides that will be presented. Again, last but definitely not least, do ask the questions that you feel are appropriate, that you feel were not issues that were not well explained during this webinar. So without further ado, let me hand it over for Eric to talk to us a little bit on how that change is required. Eric?
Good, thanks, Ray. And we can even pop to that first slide. Ray, as you pointed out, one of the challenges that we face in effective security today is that the world at large is continuing to evolve. You know, our attackers' capabilities are moving forward. The technologies that we're using are changing. What's been a challenge in security, though, is that we grow to trust the tools that we've been using and use those technologies with which we're comfortable. But practically, though, this really has to evolve at the same rate at which our environment is shifting and changing. There are far too many examples of very public data breaches that are out there. But I want to point out something interesting about the facts that are beyond the headlines. If we look at breaches such as Sony, Morrison's, all these big sort of top names, the breach activities, there's been all sorts of attacks, hackers, even nation states that are invoked. But if you actually look at what the greater risk is for most organizations, and there are a number of sources for this. I happen to cite the Verizon data breach reports. There they identify at the lead of all of the sources of breached information, total number of records and such. It's miscellaneous errors. It's the problems in regular day-to-day operation that are leading that disclosure list. Of course, the headline-grabbing events are very flashy, but if you think about what's really effective and what you want to manage, you've got to have controls put in place that are going to help with your day-to-day activities. You have to have protections that are going to manage that well. If we look at those miscellaneous errors out of the Verizon report, in fact, the lead there is misdirected recipients. There's simply the wrong data was sent to the wrong people. This is the kind of thing that's taking place where people who are simply doing their job make simple mistakes, goofs, errors, and suddenly that data disappears off to the wrong place, it's exposed, and you have a breach event. In order to manage those kinds of events, you certainly need all of the security protections that you have in place. We're not getting rid of firewalls or malware detection systems and all the rest. Those are, of course, table stakes. But we need to ensure that there's better protection in the way in which we're managing the data itself. The challenge with data is that, of course, it's what the organization lives on. It's the most critical asset that we have. But once it's released, it's out into the wild and it's gone. We think about protections that are normally wrapping around those core elements of our data, whether or not that's firewall perimeters, whether or not that's even the protections we have in the databases that store the information that we're working with. These are all things that are of course important, but we've got to ensure that once the data leaves those perimeters, whether or not those are on mobile devices, whether or not those are on the applications that we're using to bring that data out to partners, whether or not it's simple things like emailing information out to partners, customers, clients, what have you. It's all of those protections that really are the most critical. So we need to get beyond that medieval thinking of the hard perimeter and think about more effective ways to be able to manage it. So what have we been doing in this area, and sort of how do we manage it? If you hit that next slide. This is some of our background data just in terms of budgetary intent around security spend. And security spending is healthy, which is interesting even in a challenging economic environment. Almost half of those respondents at the end of last year are identifying that they're planning to increase spending this year. So, clearly there's budget that's available, but there's some challenges in that. And the next slide will show you sort of where all that's going. And this is this real eye chart here is just a small set of the various different technologies we're tracking, and these are the ones that are showing significant additional interest. And of course, any InfoSec professional is going to see this as very familiar in that there are so many different technologies in which we can invest. We're overlapping lots of different things. I mean, whether or not that's mobile devices, which is leading the list. Of course, we're dealing with the BYOD onslaught and trying to deal with that. But even managing a lot of the things that we're doing around data loss prevention, security protections, we simply are layering technology on top of technology on top of technology. Defense in depth is certainly useful, but when we start overwhelming our security teams with all manner of different types of technologies, that creates its own kind of risk. We simply have too many different systems and too many different platforms with varying levels of effectiveness in terms of what they can really deliver in terms of real manageable protections. So once you go to the next slide. And what I'd propose is that in order to really provide effective controls of what is your most critical asset, the data, you've got to start thinking about how you actually put protections around data itself. And that really winds up being making sure that the data, no matter where it goes, whether or not it's at rest in its basic systems, where it's stored, files, what have you, whether or not it's being shipped to partners, whether or not good or bad things are happening to it, you have a control that's going to ensure that the access is limited to only those places where it really ought to be put to use. Putting encryption in place in most organizations, there typically have been, everybody's got some level of work they've been doing trying to go build in security functionality in some form or fashion based on encryption, but it's typically seen as something that's complex, and there are a number of reasons for that. Typically, encryption has come with either complex policy environments. We think about what's happening with data classification. One of the key elements to really understanding what you need to protect and what you have is classifying the data that you've got. That can be something, it often gets seen as really a significant work effort to figure out from the various stakeholders for all the data, who really owns what, and what their level of classification is for each of those types of data, what's secure, what's not secure, what needs to be managed. And that whole effort to be able to deploy a comprehensive encryption environment has been one of the things that's been particularly daunting and has held back a lot of organizations to make this move. They see that transition as being potentially challenging. I'd make the case that it's worth the effort to be able to put those protections in place and potentially do that in ways that minimize the amount of work that's necessary, or at least allow you to make that transition in ways that you can stage the work that you're doing or delegate it around to the teams that are part of making that transition actually take place. What's resulted, though, is if we look at what's happened with encryption, it's typically been used in very specific use cases and a lot of the low-hanging fruit that happens to be out there. So, Ray, if you can get to the next slide. This is, again, some more of our deployment data and user-driven data that's coming out of really what are people doing with encryption today. And what's taking place currently is that it's device side primarily where most of that encryption is taking place. So if you see hard drives and laptops, these are the simple things. If you look at whole device encryption, if you look at integrated hard drive encryption, these are easy to deploy. They're pretty straightforward. The email number is interesting. If you dig down into it, it says, wow, more than half of the respondents are deploying some level of email encryption. Well, what they've done is turned on encryption capabilities for individual messages and not really a more comprehensive view of what's taking place within that email transaction. So you get the ability to go encrypt messages, but there's really not any overarching means to understand why you're encrypting or what you're encrypting that process. The thing that I find a little more disturbing is that when you start looking further down, the database, data at rest, a lot of these internal data protections simply aren't implemented in any meaningful fashion. So head to the next slide. And I'll again make the case that in order to truly provide mitigating controls, to be able to manage what is this transition in terms of the data that really is the core value piece here, you've got to be able to transition to an environment that has a better understanding of what that data is itself. We've got to stop thinking about what are these wrapper protections that have been at the perimeter that are really focused on catching the act of escape rather than putting protections in place that are going to manage the data and also can help our teams of end users understand what's reasonable use, what makes sense, and what potentially is putting our important data at risk. We think about the environments in which our employees are operating. These are areas that they're a set of folks who are just trying to get their jobs done. They want to get mobile device access. They want to be able to use the data that's critical to them. Our job as security professionals is to make sure they can do that in a meaningful fashion. And I think I've got one more click on here. If you can kick that one more. And to touch to the theme of what we're talking about today, you can't teach old dogs new tricks. You can't take our existing security protections, the firewalls, the IDS, IPS environments, and really transform them into something that's going to effectively manage data. They're there to provide protections around our environments and to really wrap those capabilities that we have. And they're effective, they're necessary, and they're useful. But we shouldn't expect them to be able to take that step into a world that where they don't necessarily have the context that's necessary to really understand whether or not the data that they see whizzing by is in fact going to the right people, is being used in the right environment, or is doing the right things when we think about it. So a number of things that are challenges in that environment, but I think effectively managing what we're doing with data can really go a long way towards enhancing our security posture. So with that, Ruth, I'd like to hand it back to you. I would also remind everyone that we do have a question box here in the webinar session, so if you have questions about anything I've talked about, by all means, get the questions in there, and as Ruth was saying, we'll answer them at the end of the webinar.
Thank you, Eric. As Eric was saying, and I fully agree, we have to look to different ideas for protection, and it's not a question or a factor of subtracting IT practices and approaches and security practices and approaches from the equation. Is a factor of looking onto how to protect that data wherever that data is, and according to the access and the need over that data that users have in every given time. And this is what we're going to talk a little bit about now. So how do you tackle that idea that the perimeter is already compromised, and how do you then should think, or our view, our take on how you should think about addressing a data-centric security implementation? As I've said, what we have, as Eric said, what we have right now, is users that all they want to do is do their job. Basically, you have ignorance, mistakes, you have policy violations that occur based on, ignorance on that policy in itself, and most often, if not to all of us, it already happened, sending the email to the wrong recipient, for example, or just having a smartphone or something like that stolen or lost, and that smartphone or that email contains sensitive information, sensitive data that should not fall into the hands of those that should not have access to it. So either by mistake or by malicious disclosure, no matter what the intent is, the fact is you have what is commonly known, the insider threat, and you need to also address it. You need that insider threat. It's really because, as we see on the news, it's not more a question of if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen. Basically, the idea that, I can, trust the autocomplete action on my function on my email client, and just by doing that, I'm sending an email to the wrong John Doe. So instead of sending it to the John, I'm sending it to Jane or something like that, and that other person already has sensitive information on its email box, and it shouldn't. So it's also not really about the super secret databases anymore. Of course, you should protect access to those, but it's really about that unstructured data that we all produce every day. It's about, that email, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, PDF, you name it, CAD drawing, any type of unstructured file that we are, all of us, producing every day with sensitive data related to a specific project, related to a specific context, related to a specific scope, that if it falls into the wrong hands, if it is accessed by those people that should not have access to it, it may jeopardize an M&A position, or intellectual property may be at risk. It's not that you don't have to deal with hackers and the external users and those guys that use masks and they try to break into your systems. No, you should, and for that you have your intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems, your firewalls, and the whole 9 yards. And as Eric said, you should keep that. It's good IT practice to keep on using and leveraging those. It's because you also need to address that insider threat, that person that again can do you harm just by doing a mistake because it doesn't have a clue, it doesn't have an idea of what it should and should not be doing. And the point that we're trying to stress out is that these things don't have to keep on happening. I mean, every time you hit the headlines, every time you open a new browser and you go into one of those big media outlets, and you will see big companies on those headlines because they've just been breached, or because sensitive information was shared or sent to people that should not have access to them. These things don't have to be happening if you do address the problem with what is conventionally known as data-centric. And what is data-centric security? In a nutshell, I'll try to explain this. If you combine four things into one single approach, one single way to address the problem. One, on the top, is the governance. The second is the classification. The third is protection. The fourth is loss prevention. So if you combine all these things, you have the ability to apply a governance model to enhance your compliance. What does that mean? It means that if you do have an information security policy that was written, drafted, defined by someone that is a consultancy company that studied your company and that decided, this type of information should be accessed by these people in what circumstances and for how long, and that other type of information should not. How do you turn that huge information security policy that was drafted into a paper or is published in an intranet somewhere into the real life, into the real life day-to-day operations of those users? That is the ability that Datacentric enables for you to apply the governance model on an everyday life. And I will show you a little bit what does that mean when it comes to the live demo. Governance also means that you can also then apply a classification, and this is the second point on the left of this slide. And the classification means the tagging, the marking, the labeling to decrease corporate liability, if nothing else, but also to teach and educate users every single time that they assess, they consume and produce sensitive data to what does it mean sensitive, and what level of sensitivity that data has, that email, that doc file, that CAD drawing, that WMV file, whatever file type you can think of. So not only you're labeling and tagging and marking and providing and adding headers, footers, watermarks, etc., so that from a visual perspective, the user, whomever that is going to access those files, will have a better understanding of what type of sensitive file that is, what type of sensitive data, and how sensitive that data is, but also what it should that person do and not do with that data in terms of sharing, in terms of posting it, etc., etc. But also in terms of classification, adding metadata, adding elements to those files so that other systems that you may have in your network will better reason over those files. So a typical example will be metadata being added to a Word file, for example, so that you can have, let's say, a DLP engine or an email gateway, for example, on your network downstream, better applying policies to that file just because it will be able to read that metadata and automatically apply the policy according to whatever the metadata is done or says. Protection in the bottom is the encryption, and Eric told us a little bit about what encryption means. I mean, you can have disk encryption, you can have all sorts of encryption, peer-to-peer encryption, you can have S-MIME encryption, you can have whatever you want from encryption, and different flavors, better said, in terms of encryption. What we advocate here is rights management as the way for you to control and to upload those policies. So with rights management, you can actually say who can do what, when, and how with your sensitive files. So not only are you applying the governance model, not only are you classifying by marking and tagging, etc., those files, you're also applying, if you so wish to, encryption so that you can uphold those policies and make sure that certain users will have certain rights over that information. Now, the beauty of rights management, because it has been around for several years now, is that it no longer has the pitfalls that it used to have. So right now you can have rights management that it's easy to use, it's easy to provision and decommission users without going into a very complex workflow in order to do that. It's easy to have, to exchange information back and forth with external users, and it's also easy to apply something else, an extra flavor, a little bit of a spice on top of encryption in terms of digital rights management, which is the role-based access control. So it's not yet a question of one size fits all in terms of policy. It's really about who gets to do what, when, and how, depending on the role that that person performs in a specific project, entity, company, you name it, and for the time, for the amount of time that that person belongs or performs that role. So an example would be if I'm the chief financial officer of a certain company, I should have access to highly sensitive financial data. But should I have access to highly sensitive sales-related data? Maybe not. According to the governance model, going through classification and the marking and tagging in terms of education and enforcing it with the encryption of rights management, you can apply this use case in real life, as I will show you on the live demo in just a while. Loss prevention on the right, this is really to say that this is all interesting, but there would be one element missing if you do not have the ability to apply those policies and to make sure that those policies that are based on the governance model are applied to those data files without asking users to make decisions. The idea here is to have content-aware capability in terms of a policy engine, or context-aware capability in terms of a policy engine, or even file attributes in the forms of metadata to apply policy rules, or a combination of these things. And based on specific keywords or phrases or strings or regular expressions or anything that are inside a specific document or inside a specific email, or based on context, which is to say, to whom am I sending this email to, where am I saving this file to, or a combination of these factors, or based on, for example, file size, based on file owner in terms of the metadata, the attributes of the file, or a combination of all these things, apply a specific classification, apply a specific protection, and do not rely on users to make that decision because, probably they do not know it. It's not in their job description. One person once told us that, chief information security officers, that's only one. Do not ask your users to be chief information security officers, because if you do, they will say, I will default back into the easiest route and path possible, which is absolutely do nothing. So how do you apply in real life that combination of governance, classification, protection, and loss prevention in order to come up with the new perimeter spectrum? So do not think like Eric was saying, in medieval terms, in terms of the wall that will protect you from external attacks. How do you make a wall inside every single piece of file, every single piece of information turned into an unstructured file, wherever that file is, wherever that information goes? First, what you need to do is to identify what's sensitive from what's not, what should be protected from what should not be protected. Because let's face it, we all produce information on our daily lives, and if I'm sending an email to the guy next to me saying, hey, let's go to lunch, that's really not sensitive information. But if I'm sharing with that person, some credit card numbers, social security numbers, or, patient records or anything like that, I'm actually sharing sensitive information that needs to be identified as such, needs to be labeled as such, etc. So based on an engine, a policy engine that is triggered by content, context, and metadata, you need to identify what needs to be protected, what needs to be ensured that the wrong people don't have access to it. After you identify what is to be protected, you then need to classify it. You then need to grant that file, grant that information a label, a tag, something that will identify it as internal use only, or top secret information, or restricted use only information, or IPA related information, or PCI DSS related information, whatever it makes sense for you as a company, whatever it makes sense for you as, for example, a mandate from a sector regulator, for example. So you identify what's secret, you need then to classify it and label that with a specific classification level that that file should have. Once you do that, then you need to tag it, mark it. You need to explicitly make it visible, not only for the users by means of headers, footers, watermarks, tags, colors, borders, whatever it makes sense for you, but also for the systems that will reason over that data by means of metadata that is automatically added to those files, that file is sensitive in nature. That file should be protected. That file should not go to recipient X, Y, or Z, or that file should not be shared via a web-based drive, or that file should not be allowed to do this, that, or the other by different recipients or different users. So you identify what's sensitive or not. You then classify it by labeling it. You mark and tag it with disclaimers and metadata, etc. You should also need to protect it, again, as we've said, by an encryption. And the point here is, if you go with the encryption, even if you go with digital rights management, you need to be careful in terms of which digital rights management or enterprise rights management, as you want to call it, you will choose from. You can choose from a proprietary, vendor proprietary rights management solution, or a more generic rights management solution that is present everywhere. What we think is appropriate is that if you choose a more generic rights management, something that is pre-built into 80 to 85% of the systems that we all use, and that is the Microsoft rights management capability. If you fix some of the things in that rights management, it's to make it work better, to make it work more broader in terms of OSs and in terms of file systems, you will have a very comprehensive way to enforce restrictions in terms of the access and the rights that people and users have over that information, while still enforcing the role-based access control that we've talked a little bit a while ago. Last but definitely not least, you'll have to track and understand who did what, when, and how, and who is doing what, when, and how with that sensitive data. So it's not a question of identifying, classifying, marking, tagging, and protecting per se. You also need to track and report for forensic analysis, for audit trails, for remote kill and blacklisting purposes, who is doing what, when, and how, so that if you identify that something's wrong is happening, you will be able to act upon it, and you'll be able also to understand who was the person that did this, who were the users that were assessing, who were the persons that were doing the wrong things with the wrong data. So without further ado, the idea now is to give you a brief live demo of RightsWatch, which is the solution that Watchful Software has developed in order to address this problem, and it fits perfectly into the realm of data-centric security. Again, I encourage you to ask questions on the question box that you have on GoToWebinar. I know that we have a couple of questions already being posed. Patricia at the end will synthesize all those questions so that we can ensure that we will answer to all of those. So going in terms of the demo that I've promised you, the idea is, for example, let's open Word, for example, as one of the productivity tools that we all use every day. And here, what you have is, I'm going to start by just creating some dummy text here. This is lorem ipsum in Latin. It does not have any sensitive information here. It does not have anything that is insensitive in nature. So, as a user, I may or may not understand, I may or may not know if this is sensitive or not. So basically what happens is that if I save this file into my desktop, for example, you can see that a classification is automatically chosen by RightsWatch to default this classification of this file into a public. Now, there's no combo boxes, there's no pop-ups, there's no taking the user out of his normal workflow in order to make the classification and the identification and the marking and tagging and the protection and even the tracking of this file, because it has no sensitive information. Now, what I'm showing you here, it's no demo environment. What I'm showing you here is really my own laptop and showing you my own screen, so that you can see that this is Watchful Software's information security policy scheme. At Watchful Software, we've chosen to have a 4-level classification scheme that is labeled as public, internal use only, confidential, and secret. As a user, I can have policy rules being applied, as in this case, a default rule that states that if there isn't any sensitive information inside the document or in the metadata of the document, or if because I'm not saving this document to a specific location that needs to be encrypted and classified, by default this file is public. Now I can choose to override it and classify this as internal, confidential, or secret, and you can see that underneath that you have tooltips that will tell me, educate me as a user to what does it mean to classify this file as secret, confidential, internal, or public. Now I can click the save button and save it as it is, or I can choose to apply a different classification. Once I choose to apply confidential, let's say for this file, what I'm doing is I'm actually choosing a specific mark and tags and classification that was chosen to be applied to documents that are confidential in nature by my company. Now I don't get to choose what marks and tags are applied. Those are defined according to the policy. Now, what you also have is the ability to have a segregation of policy schemes, policy classifications in terms of the projects that I belong to or the departments that I belong to. So let's take, for example, Project X here. Project X is in Watchful Software, an example of a project that I belong to. I'm responsible for product management at Watchful Software. I'm also project manager for Project X. Now, from a specific context of Project X, I can classify information as unclassified, operations related, or management related. Now you see that there's a difference between when I have Watchful Software as public, internal, confidential, or secret, or Project X as unclassified, operations related, or management related. There's a difference being that I'm dealing with a specific different scope, a specific context. In this Project X, I'm dealing with information that relates to a specific project, and as a project manager and as the policy states, information can be classified in a certain way. When I'm dealing with generic information inside my company, information can be classified in 4 different ways. So let's cancel this. Let's go back. And somewhere around here, let's say that I have this thing here. This thing is like a demonstration policy rules that we have that will trigger a rule to classify this document as secret. So the next time I try to save it, and I'm going to save it into my desktop, again, it will automatically trigger the secret classification. And it also, not only does it do that, but it also tells me that an automatic classification rule was applied as part of a security policy. The point I'm trying to make here is that you can have different tooltips being shown here for the users. You can have different ways on how to classify those files and have those policies being applied. And have, and even in different languages, those policies being applied depending on what language the user is actually using the system. Now watch what happens if when I try to downgrade the classification level of this document. Remind you that it has now something that triggered the rule as secret. If I try to downgrade it into public, I can no longer save this, and you can see that the save button is grayed out until I sign a disclaimer for non-repudiation issues, for example, that yes, I acknowledge that I'm overwriting a security clearance that was defined, or a policy that was defined by my company, and that I want to override it. If I say no, for example, it will revert back into secret. If I say yes, it will change and allow me to save the classification. Now let's save this as secret, or let's save this as Project X management just for demonstration purposes. I'm going to save this into my desktop as a Word document. And what you will see is that RightsWatch is now turning this Word document into something that is being identified as sensitive, classified accordingly, and marked and tagged, and also encrypted, as I will show you. So basically you have a header that is unique to me because I was the user that actually produced this document. So basically it has elements that are just myself, like dynamic classification, if you will, in one nutshell. And you have watermarks that you can define the shape, the color, the size, the location where these watermarks will have, just for, again, for demonstration and for information purposes of the user. And you also have, a footer inside this document that has, it's the unique identifier from the digital rights management that is also placed in here. Now, what comes into these headers, footers, and watermarks, it's completely up to you. You will decide what needs to be, what it's there and what's not according to your policy. What you can also see, because we're actually encrypting this file using Microsoft's rights management, it also has tooltips underneath that will tell the user that this is information that should not be disclosed. Again, educating the user, telling the user what does it mean and what should be classified and what should not be classified. What I also would like to do now is, if I'm able to show you my Outlook, for example, as my default email client, you can see that the same system of classification and interface appears when I'm drafting a new email. Again, the same policies are applied according to my role inside my company. Again, I'm responsible for product management, and by default, this email, because it does not have any sensitive information at all, it does not have any recipients, it does not have any content in it, it's defaulted into a public classification. So let's say that I'm sending this into or to my CEO, Charles Foley. Because Charles has an email domain address from watchfulsoftware.com, and because the policy was defined as such, the system defaults the classification of this email as internal. This means that, by definition, if I'm sending an email to recipients that are all of them included in my workers or users with a specific email domain address, it automatically defaults into an internal classification. The point we're trying to make here is that the users don't have to make the decisions. They don't have to know the information security policy in order to apply that information security policy and governance model, because the system, in this case RightsWatch, will do it for them using those content-aware, in this case context-aware, because it's about the recipients to whom I'm sending this file to or this email to, that will automatically apply those policies. Now watch what happens if I say this is, again, watchful secret information. WSW is like an acronym for watchful software, and when you do that, it will automatically pick up that this should be secret information. Now think of this WSW secret as, for example, a project related keyword or a credit card number, a social security number, or anything that you wish to trigger the policy based on. In this case, again, the secret classification is shown. You have a tooltip that, non-modal alert, as they say, that will help the user in being aware of what is going on. And if I try to downgrade this into public, you can see that the send button is grayed out. I can no longer send this until I sign the disclaimer that yes, I acknowledge that I want to override the security policy that was defined by my sysadmin or whomever has control over the policy definition. Again, the point here is that you can then add tags to the subject line. You can add headers and footers, and you can add elements that will better tell the recipient or recipients of this message that this is sensitive in nature and should be dealt appropriately and accordingly. In terms of the demos that I wanted to show, this is practically this is just we're just scratching the surface in terms of the capabilities of RightsWatch. You can also address, let's say, for example, legacy data. How do you address legacy data when you're dealing with a solution that needs to classify and protect your sensitive information? RightsWatch will enable you to address that legacy data automatically and apply policies on that legacy data without troubling the users to do it manually or a file at a time. You can also address use cases that deal with SharePoint, for example. How do you leverage SharePoint as a content management solution for sharing purposes, for sharing of files and information, even with those external users? So how do you make it so that even if those external users do not have any RightsWatch installed, or nor do they have a license of RightsWatch, are they able to upload and download information from that SharePoint server, and making sure that whenever that information is uploaded into a specific container, which is the same thing as saying as a specific folder inside SharePoint, that those files are automatically classified and protected according to the policies that you want them to have. Or even if you're dealing with mobile devices, for example, this is what I've shown you is in the realm of a laptop and a desktop. But if you want to do the same with Android, iOS, BlackBerry, RightsWatch is really capable to extend that capability of enforcing the classification, enforcing the protection, and making sure that only people with the appropriate security clearance will be able to consume encrypted and protected information and sensitive information. As I was saying, RightsWatch is able to address those BYOD projects, if you will, in order to enable your users to bring their own devices, their Androids, their mobile devices, etc., into the equation. Not willing to extend the webinar that much. We're now going to the Q&A sessions. I know that we have a few questions that were already asked by some of you. So Patricia, if you will, the idea is for you to organize those questions and to ask either Eric or me if there's any questions that someone has asked for us to answer.
Sure. There's one first question for Eric. And it comes from Robert. And the question is, I'm already doing device encryption. Isn't this redundant?
Well, a simple answer to that one, no, it's not redundant. Device encryption, of course, is good and useful. It protects all of the data that happens to be on a device. But the limitation is that you don't have protections that are data-centric, and you won't have the ability to protect that data movement either onto or off of the device, which is really the fundamental issue. Of course, you want to be able to mitigate against device loss, how many millions of devices are lost every year, but you need to have more sophistication in terms of how you're managing the data that's truly the crucial part of what you're trying to protect on the device.
Okay. So next question comes from Stephen, and this is to Rui. Do I need to boil the ocean and set up every single rule beforehand?
Well, Stephen, that's a very interesting question. No, you don't. In fact, that's one of the things that data-centric security allows you to do, and that RightsWatch will allow you to implement, which is, for those of you that do not have an information security policy that, foresees and predicts every single thing that might just happen, you can set up some very easy policy rules to get you started and grow from there and learn on how to apply more policy rules or more constraints and policies according to the needs that you will be having over time. So the short answer is no, you don't have to foresee everything that might just happen to decrease, for example, your false positives as in the case of a DLP. You can start small and start to walk and only then start to run and have a more rigid policy being applied.
Okay, so now from John to Eric. My security policies are already complex. How much extra work is involved in setting up configurations and policies for data classification?
Well, this is one of the things that you always want to be aware of is really what's that operational workload that's necessary. But actually, I think Rui just identified what's really the fundamental piece of this, which is this isn't this shouldn't be an all or nothing. And I think what Rui was describing is that this is a transition that you can really start to go build the policy capabilities on what you're trying to protect first, to do this in a staged way so that it isn't overwhelming. And that is a decision point around the kinds of protections you're putting in place. You want to consider what that operational load is as well. If you have to hire a team to be able to roll this out, it's not going to be as effective.
Okay, so we have now a question from David to Rui. How does it address legacy data files?
Yeah, we've talked a little bit, or I've addressed a little bit about this. One of the fundamental asks that we get from our prospects and customers and people with whom we talk to is that, you know, I can set up policies and I understand that I can do that, but how do I address all those terabytes of legacy data that I already have in-house that are stored in a central repository or stored everywhere? How am I to automatically apply those very same policies, not from here into the future, but from here into the past, everything that I already have? And we typically, you know, label those existing files as legacy data files. So RightsWatch has, or data-centric security should have, the ability for it to deploy agents, to deploy tools that will automatically scan the content of those files and automatically apply the same policies to those files without asking any user involvement in that sense. So basically you can deploy what we in RightsWatch call the Global Protector, and the Global Protector, it's basically a tool that will analyze the content, the context, and the metadata of specific files that you wish to scan and automatically apply those policies to those files with the very same tags and labels and colors and watermarks, etc., and also applying the protection if you wish to.
Okay, I think we still have time for a couple more. So there's a question from Peter to Eric. My firewall already has DLP. How is this different?
Oh, good question. So if you think about where you're putting protections in place, you know, the firewall is really part of our perimeter, and that having protections for data loss, you know, for the actual act of exfiltration, you know, as it's actually exiting our environment, is certainly useful, but it has some limitations. The biggest issue is that it has no context. And it also doesn't involve the user in this process. And I think one of the things, hopefully, that people were gaining from the webinar is that one of the most valuable things that we can do for our user communities is help them understand what these security policies really mean, and to do this education piece. And that's really best done at point of use. The problem is, once the data is flowing out of your firewall, it's, how do you react to it? What do you do with it? Well, you can send notifications, you can send alerts, but the user's already done the thing that wasn't great to begin with, which is they attached something important or critical, or credit card numbers or personal information, what have you. It's far better to start from a point of use where you can help to educate the user in the fact that, this is what we see as sensitive information, this is why. And again, from an overall security stance, to make sure that you can bring your users into that overall enhanced security posture and enhanced understanding. And so that's, you know, perimeters are certainly useful, and the DLP pieces there are useful if, you know, you've got, you know, attackers who are trying to migrate information out, if you've got disgruntled employees who are using, you know, alternate means to be able to send this traffic. But, you know, far and away the most important thing is to be able to get your regular, you know, employee user community smarter about what's taking place, and point of use is far and away the best way to do that. And you can also apply context there, so you can do things like figure out who's the recipient, apply opportunistic encryption as you're starting to send it to, you know, approved users, or at least correct the user with an understanding if they're trying to send that data to an unapproved user. So so much more nuance can be applied when you're actually doing that at point of use.
Okay, so I guess that's all the time that we have for now.
We
Thank
have
you,
one.
Patricia. Thank you, Eric. Thank you all.
We have one last question. I'm sorry. It was the last one.
Okay.
That just came in. So CISOs are afraid of changing to new and necessary products. Is education only way to change CISOs? Which one of you guys want to take this one?
Eric, do you want to take this one?
Sure. So the difficulty, again, our challenge in this environment is deploying effective protections, and that does require a change of mindset. And when we take a look at technologies that are outside of what people are comfortable with, that certainly provides certainly a challenge. But if we think about where we're investing in security, this really is a point at which, as information security professionals, we need to think about what's effective. And you should already have an environment where you're looking at end user education. You should already, of course, be looking at putting protections in place. And when we think about sort of point of use encryption tools, a la what Watchful provides, those are the kinds of things that should be some obvious next steps. Those are things that, yes, you have to overcome some resistance there, but if we think about the kinds of mitigating controls that it puts in place, these are the kinds of tools that should make a lot of sense for CISOs, even those who are a little reluctant to make those first steps. But these are useful paths, and yep, we are heading into new general technologies, but if you take a look at what these technologies are, how they fit your operational mode, how you can integrate them into the way in which you're really doing business day in, day out, those are the pieces that really should be the points of value that are worth investing in.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so Patricia, if there's no more questions, I'll just end the webinar right now. I mean, thank you all for joining us. As I've said, you will have the recording of this webinar made available onto you on watchfulsoftware.com, and we will make sure that you'll get an email with a link where you can have access to it, not just the recording, but also the slide deck. And of course, if there's any other questions or anything that you wish us to address, by all means reach out to us at Watchful Software or even at Eric's email on 451 Research. Thank you all for joining us. I wish you all a very pleasant day.